Hello and welcome to our webinar, The Use of Hydrotherapy in Stress Fracture Recovery of Canada National Volleyball Team Captain. This is Kyle Vowler from HydroWorx and I'll be the moderator for this session. We're excited to bring you this educational content today and certainly appreciate you taking the time to join us. This webinar is being recorded and a recording link will be emailed to all attendees afterward. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. Please type your questions into the chat bar in the webinar dashboard on the right side of your screen at any time during the presentation, and I will read them to our presenter at the end. We'd also like to ask you to fill out a brief survey that will pop up as you exit the webinar. As always, your feedback is extremely important to us. And at this time, I would like to introduce our speaker. Nick Held is a member of the Integrated Practitioner Team at Fortius Sport and Health as the Director of Hydrotherapy. Nick brings additional experience as a strength and conditioning coach. Previously, Nick held the positions of sports scientist with Field Hockey Canada, strength and conditioning coach at Hydroathletics, and behavioral coach with Wellspring UK. He exemplifies his passion for education and continuing development as he is currently completing his PhD in experimental medicine at University of British Columbia. His research interests include the use of water immersion in performance, rehabilitation, and recovery, as well as long-term athlete development. Nick has years of experience using hydrotherapy to help individuals optimize performance and rehabilitation and reach their full potential. In addition, he has presented at multiple conferences in North America and was nominated for the HydroWorx Excellence in Aquatics Award. And with that, I will let Nick begin his presentation.
Thank you, Kyle. It's a good introduction, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. My hope is that I can provide you with a little bit of information, and at the end you'll have my contact information. So if you have any other questions, concerns, things that you'd like some feedback on, or things you can give me feedback on, I'd be very interested in hearing that. So as Kyle pointed out, I am the Director of Hydrotherapy at Fortius Sport and Health. So I'll talk a little bit about what Fortius is, and then I'm also completing my PhD in cardiovascular physiology. So again, this is how to use water immersion to enhance performance on land, mostly in team sport athletes, for example, in Field Hockey Canada. So Fortius Sport and Health, here's a little image of it here in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's an integrated athlete development center, and we're really focusing on optimizing human or athlete performance for life. So we're lucky to work in the same roof with a lot of different disciplines that are listed here, and I won't go through all of them, but what I will point out is that in the case we're talking about today with Gavin Smith, we focus primarily on using strength and conditioning, physiotherapy, massage therapy, and hydrotherapy with the HydroWorx 2000. Obviously, today we're going to talk mostly about the rehab protocol with hydrotherapy. And then in addition, there was an orthopedic surgeon to complete the surgery, and that was external and then referred into Fortius. So the purpose of the webinar, and what I'm hoping to get out of this and that you will get out of this, is we're going to discuss how hydrotherapy and the HydroWorx 2000 was used for the entire rehabilitation process of Gavin Smith. And I have entire in capital letters because I find a lot of people, and the feedback I've received from a lot of people in similar scenarios is they tend to use the pool as kind of just the first few weeks of rehab, maybe just to initiate some movements, or maybe it's just for walking. Whereas here at Fortius, one of my main goals when I started working here and developing the department was to make sure that there's application throughout the entire rehab process into performance, return to play, and into recovery. The second thing I want to do is provide visual progressions through videos and rationale for the exercises we used in this specific case. So my hope is that some of these exercises you are already using, some of these exercises aren't brand new to you, but hopefully there's a few that may interest you, or you may use similar models, and this might be another way to do it potentially. I really want to highlight that how we use the pool is more than just walking and running, because I always find people, when they hear treadmill, that's all they think about, and there's a lot more application that can be used throughout any rehab process for a variety of conditions and clients. So today we're talking about Gavin Smith. So Gavin is a 30-year-old professional international volleyball player. So as you saw in the title, he is the captain of Volleyball Canada, but he also plays professionally in Poland right now and they're the 4th ranked club that he plays for. I'm not going to try to pronounce the name, but you could look that up after if you're interested in that. And currently, Gavin is one of the top ranked players worldwide at his position. So original injury took place in May 2013. The rationale then was overuse, potential overloading, and mechanics leading into his jump and how he rotated and loaded off of that leg. August 2013, X-ray showed multiple stress fractures, and so a surgery began September 2013 to help aid in the recovery of the stress fractures, help support the tibia, and that lasted for 2 seasons. Come late July, again diagnosed with a stress fracture. There was some conservative methods to try to keep him playing, try to progress the strength and healing. But then after a few months, as you see, it regressed in December 2015, and surgery was recommended. This was a challenging situation for him to undergo surgery. It's a challenging decision. Being one of the pivotal members of the team, they did not qualify. They were not qualified at the time of surgery. There was hope that they would be able to qualify in the preliminary qualifications without Gavin. That did not work out as they planned, so his return for what we'll talk about is the next qualification, the last-ditch qualification, if you will, for volleyball. We were trying to get him back for, which was a fairly quick window. So just a timeline. Surgery took place at the start of this year on January 12th, and he entered Fortius on January 22nd. He began hydro on February 4th. So typically we will tend to get people into hydrotherapy a little bit quicker than that, usually using Opsite or something to protect the incision. But because of the tight window, the surgeon presented some concern over potential risk of infection, and something that with the timeline we had, he was worried that if anything came up, there could be some concerns there. So from the recommendation from the surgeon, we decided to hold off a little bit longer, but still got him in prior to a month, so 3 weeks, nearly almost 4 weeks getting in. He was in hydrotherapy this entire time, so just because hydrotherapy is in the top corner as a starting point doesn't mean that he left hydrotherapy at that point. But he began strength and conditioning on March 23rd, which coincided with beginning beach volleyball. We'll talk a little bit about that later, where this was not really, it was recreationally competitive, and he wasn't playing at a high level. It was more just monitoring jumps and adding jumps to monitor the stress load. He returned to his team training in late April 2016, so they trained in Gatineau, Quebec. So this was him heading back across the country to join his team for the Olympic qualifier, where he had about 3 weeks of training with his team prior to leaving, and they ended up qualifying in the Olympic qualifier that they were very excited about, not necessarily a guarantee, so they played really well, and come August 7th is when Rio started, so pretty quick for qualification to turn around. So with hydrotherapy at Fortius, one of our main goals is to stay one step ahead of land-based rehab. So all of this is done in conjunction with physio, with massage, with strength conditioning. It's not siloed off where we do hydro and then we move in to land-based rehab. So what I always try to tell people, and what we always try to do, is when you're doing floor work, band work in physio, we'll be doing some double leg functional movement under your own control in hydro, where the water allows, the buoyancy allows a little bit more stability, control, and safety. As they move on to double leg work on land, we are now moving on to single leg work in the water. Single leg work on land moves into energy system development, or running or increasing that load and speed in the pool. And then they're getting back to doing that on land with a return to run program, or gradually increasing the load or intensity of jumps in this scenario. And we are then pushing the limit a bit more in the pool. So it's really used throughout the entire process. And oftentimes it's used for physical reasons, whether that is with tissue compliance or stress to the body or physiological load. But on the other side, it's also huge for social, for emotional, and for psychological well-being. Having the athlete who's used to training 15 to 20 hours a week, being back in the pool, being moving, being working through ranges of motion and exercises, really helps with that confidence. And then when they learn the exercises, they learn how it should look from the visual feedback, the corrections that they need to make so that the movement looks functional and proper. They start to have an understanding of those movements. They start to have a knowledge of the corrections that can be seen and that are expected, so that as they go back to do that next stage on land in the coming weeks, they already have an idea of what's expected and how to move forward with that. So this is a typical timeline, typical pathway that we will have. This one's more specific to Gavin. But with clinical management, moving on to movement skills development, talking about energy system enhancement or energy system development, increasing the load, the explosive movement in the water, and then monitoring training load. So we'll talk about each of these different areas moving forward to the 2016 Rio Olympics. So clinical management was not necessarily a major part for Gavin. Because we ended up going in the pool so late, he wasn't doing any real water immersion. So I just wanted to point out how we normally do it, where we do have the hot tubs, we do have the polar plunge and the thermal plunge pools from HydroWorx. So that's commonly used in a lot of our rehabilitation cases, just to either for increasing range of motion or mostly for inflammatory control and for increased nutrient transport. So what I want to do right now is move into more of the movement skills development and show some of the exercises that we used with Gavin and how we progressed these through. So there'll be a series of videos that I will just show and go through. So starting off, always just a double leg squat. Basic squat, mostly trying to look for how is this individual loading. Are they loading more to the uninjured side versus the injured side? How is their pelvic control? And basically, are they moving functionally? And this can then be adapted. You'll see the hands on the hips. I usually let people start with their hands more in the water, get used to loading through the legs, whereas another element for increasing the demand is by putting the hands on the hips for requiring more balance. From there, we'll move that into a lateral squat, where you have a little bit more of a lateral application of force into the ground and starting to move sideways and controlling back up. And this can be done. This one here, we don't have a band on, but we often put some TheraBand on as well, just to try to get a bit more activation of hip abductors and glute med through the exercises. Next, we move on to just a standard lunge. And this is sometimes for helping with range of motion depending on the injury, but mostly for Gavin, it was for being able to load evenly through both shins, both tibia, with one in the front, one in the back. It's initiation, not necessarily single leg movement at all, obviously, but it allows a little bit more of that lateral instability where you're balancing over a staggered stance. From there, we move into moving into a reverse lunge. So this is kind of the initiation of a single leg movement where you have a small point of time where you're spending time only over one leg, and then creating that force into the ground to lift yourself back up and create that contraction. So for Gavin, this is one where off the start he had a little bit of trouble with, where he was completely loading over the uninjured side, the non-surgical side. So he spent some time just trying to talk about pelvic control and making sure he's over top of his center of mass and his ability to load through both limbs evenly. We progressed that a little bit further with more of a transition lunge, so pushing from, or a walking lunge you can call it, so controlling from a reverse lunge into a forward lunge where you're shifting weight from the back leg to the front leg. This is one that often becomes challenging for individuals coming back from any lower extremity injury, mostly because I find one of the most challenging things with people with lower body injuries is that initiation of force into the ground again. So typically when we start these exercises, you'll see a lot of swinging from the hips and trying to produce as much momentum against the resistance of the water as possible. So really trying to get that application where as they come forward, they're gaining confidence, they're loading over that front leg, and then they're using that leg to push off, then produce force through the back leg and control again down through the motion. Next, we move into more of a reverse lunge and coming up onto one leg. Oh, this one is, sorry about that. So this one, okay. So typically on that last one, I think it comes halfway through. So let me I'll start that and move partway through. So if it doesn't come up, I'll just explain it. But moving from the back leg, coming up, standing on one leg. So here we're adding another element of balance and control where as they push off, you're coming up through good knee extension on the stance leg. You're working into that single leg move with the lateral control of the ankle. They're getting good co-contraction of the quads, the hamstrings, the glutes, and they're really pushing into the ground. And that's one of the key things here where they're not just letting themselves drop and fall into the water because the buoyancy will hold them, but they're keeping that contact with the floor as they come eccentrically through the lunge and then pushing up concentrically as well. So again, just to add a little bit more of the lateral component, we come into a lateral squat, which then comes up to control over one leg and balance. For this one, I find is a really good exercise because with a lot of people where they have a little bit of dysfunction between the left and right where they're not loading evenly, as they move to step up, they try to get that balance over their center of mass or over their contact point with the upper body. So they'll swing their shoulders over but not actually move their hips over. So on this one, we're really trying, and if they do that, that water will push them a bit and they don't really get that balance. So the important thing from this one is they're coming down to a double leg even stance and then they're pushing up to one solid movement onto a single leg. And then finally moving into a single leg squat. Again, the ability to come down, to control, to keep everything from the hip, the knee, the foot in alignment, hopefully getting the glutes and hamstrings working, not just kicking onto the quad, but everything looks fairly balanced. They're able to control over that. And these are things that I will talk next time in the next section as well too, but this is one exercise that I use as a precursor to when I think somebody is able to run in the water. Because I get that question often, when do we initiate? And if somebody has good control of a nice single leg movement in the water and their walking gait on land is good with no limp and they're able to control that, that gives me an idea that looking through the research where running in the water is often referred to as 1 times body weight, they're able to, if they're able to do it on land, they can control that in the water as well, considering running is more just a series of single leg squats in a sense. And this is the last one I like to do as well. So this is just single leg balance, and the jet is blowing on the individual. So again, this is something with the hands out of the water. It's challenging the body a bit more. They'll go on both legs. You can judge that as long as you want, 20, 30 seconds. And then they'll go around the pool and face in all different directions. So one thing I like about this exercise, if somebody has, for example, if they have a lot of the collapsing arch and the foot and the ankle are pronating, it'll show in one direction where the jet's pushing in that way and allows them to control against that and try to keep a neutral ankle. The other thing is it shows a lot of confidence. So with Gavin, when I had him originally stand on one leg working against the jets, and these jets can be set to all different parameters. Usually I start at 40%. But when we had him standing, he would, when he was trying to balance, when he'd lose his balance, everything would come from trunk sway and that postural sway of the upper body versus having that confidence in the ankle and the lower leg to help balance them and gain that proprioceptive control. So as it went on, you could see the confidence develop where he'd actually work more through the ankle versus working completely through the upper body to gain balance. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about energy system enhancement, energy system development, and that's something that we often use the pool for most clients, but definitely for Gavin was a big case. And then we'll go into the increased load and explosive movements. But these aren't anything that are necessarily mutually exclusive. I don't think they necessarily go from one step to the next. I think they're all kind of combined depending on what movements you're using for increasing the load. So one thing I originally liked to do is just a high knee progression. So this starts by somebody moving dynamically, landing underneath their center of mass, making sure they're landing with dorsiflexion and that contact point is right underneath them. And they will start by working just coming over the ankles. As long as there's no pain, as long as that feels good, they come up to calf level. And then eventually they'll come up to a full high knee where they're coming up over their knees and applying more force into the ground and then engaging that stretch shortening cycle of through the ankle to come off the ground quick. So again, this is something, as I mentioned before, is another precursor to running. I like doing this first, making sure there's no response, making sure the client feels good, especially with Gavin with the tibial stress fractures, making sure there's no pain, no sharp pain with this before we move on to running where he's coming through an increased range of motion through the hip and not necessarily landing right under his center of mass, which from biomechanical research lets us know that the kinetic forces are, and the vertical ground reaction force is reduced quite a lot when you're landing under your center of mass and right underneath your body and creating that propulsion force moving forward versus a braking force by landing in front of your center of mass. So then after we do the progression, everything feels good. We build on those high knees, but we add some movement to it. So Gavin's moving forward, he's moving back, and he's actually starting to create some of that propulsive force in the forward direction versus just staying in the same spot. So pushing in and driving back, and then doing the same as he's coming backwards as well. And then from there, we tend to get into a run. So for Gavin, we started running fairly slow. This was because of the tolerance of his shin. And this is a little bit later on. This isn't his first session by any means. So a little bit about tolerance, but also just because we're just trying to develop that aerobic capacity and that aerobic base off the start. So part of it's physiological, part of it's just that physical stimulus. But we really want to make sure that he has as much time working on that aerobic base as possible. I know he works in an anaerobic sport where he's using a lot of that creatine phosphate system, where he's creating a lot of high-intensity movement. But that being said, those matches go on for a long time, and the ability to have a strong aerobic system helps with recovery after each high-intensity burst, but it's also optimizing his ability to produce high-intensity actions and work with that high-intensity exercise. So eventually we start increasing the speed. We start moving from a longer duration, lower heart rate, lower VO2 output of the aerobic base, moving into longer duration, higher intensity intervals before we work into more high-intensity sprints. So with Gavin, we had the ability to work him pretty hard in the pool. He could get into a full-on sprint, and this just really helped with working on, number one, his application of force into the ground, really pushing through the treadmill, and secondly, some energy system development, as we were talking about before. So now continuing on to increasing the load, increasing the explosive movement. This, going back to high knees, I tend to do after running, but it's more, this is high knees, moving around the pool, so you're adding a lateral component into it. You're pushing back, you're pushing to the side. The key to this is, again, you're creating that contact point right underneath the center of mass. You're now adding a lateral component into it, but everything is pre-planned. Everything is predicted for Gavin. And the thing I like about the water is if you land right underneath you, the water holds you, the water balances you. But as soon as you start to push away from your contact point, the water will push you a little bit. You'll start to slip. So it's good feedback for me, and it's also good feedback for the athlete to make sure they're landing right underneath their center of mass. So then from that, I progress into more reaction-based. So this time, this is uncontrolled movement. This is, I will tell him which way to go, and he reacts off of that. So again, this can be used within energy system development. Obviously, you're training different physiological systems here. As you can see, checking the heart rate monitor, asking for where he's at, and keeping in mind the changes that happen when in water physiologically. But this is the one I like to do to see how the person's moving, see if they're able to contact underneath the center of mass, push the same off the left, push the same off the right, and it's more reactive and less predictive for them. And then we moved into our jumping progressions, which for Gavin, being a volleyball player, we found to be fairly important for him and something that we really tried to focus on. So originally this was an initiation of jumping that was done in the pool, and then it started being done on land and still at greater intensity in the pool, but this was also a focus for S&C, for strength and conditioning as well, so increasing the load, increasing the tolerance to the bone, but also increasing that eccentric landing from jumps. So the thing for us, we would do these jumps at various water heights. Just because of the resistance of the water, concentrically you can change a little bit of the muscle action and then also control that the high stress eccentric landing from the jump. So while we were building up on land, we were still building on the water. We're using the water to try to really, number one, initiate the tolerance back to land, but number two, try to enhance its performance, as we'll talk a little bit about later about what the literature shows. So we started with just a double leg squat jump, hands on the hips, so he's driving mostly through the legs and obviously up through the hips and glutes, and a good extension there, but not just swinging his arms. And again, this was 2 different heights, as you can see. So changing the load, and we were lucky with the HydroWorx 2000 that we have the ability to change the floor height. So we had the opportunity to increase progressively the amount of eccentric stress going through the body as he's landing. So we moved from a simple Scott jump more into a counter movement jump where he's coming down through the motion eccentrically and creating and trying to reduce that amortization phase and increase the amount of concentric muscle action that he can achieve through the resistance of the water. Again, all done at different heights. And then from there, making that repeated. So he's landing underneath his center of mass. He's pushing up, but he's getting into that triple flexion of the knees, the ankles, and the hips, and he's getting into triple extension as he's driving through the ground and creating that force. And of course, from that, and then another double leg one is kind of just double leg ankle hops, where not getting as much as flexion at the knees and hips, but just trying to engage that stretch shortening cycle and getting him off the ground fast and reducing that amount of time that he's on the ground. So this is just a series of progressions. We did double leg before we moved into more single leg movements. So our initiation of single leg jumping, I always like to do a single leg jump with a double leg landing. Again, just where the high amounts of stress and force comes in with the landing, he starts initiating that on a double leg. And obviously, not all of this is a progression through one session. This takes time depending on the response of, on how Gavin feels his response and how his leg is responding to the exercises. But I just want to give an idea of the typical transition that we can go through. So then, once he's progressing through that double leg landing, we'll move into more single leg squat jumps. Again, we're looking here at how he's landing. Is that knee moving into knee abduction there? Is he collapsing into valgus, or can he control that underneath him? If he can't control this in the water where he's at, for these 70 to 50% body weight removed, how is he going to control it on land? And this could either be because of the injury and he's not 50-50, or maybe that gives us an insight into why the stress fractures were created in the first place. So we get that feedback and about how he's moving, and we try to work to build that. And then we do counter movement jump as well. So same thing, we did double leg on both legs. Again, you have the opportunity to give them the use of their hands where they can land and help control themselves a little bit, or you have the ability to go hands on the hips to make things a bit more challenging as well. And we ended up doing hands on the hips, obviously, as he was progressing through. Next, just that single leg repeated jump. So as he moves along, the ability for him to control and not collapse into valgus there, and the ability for him to complete those jumps. So we were changing the number of jumps he was doing the entire time, and we'll talk a bit of that with that later with the training load monitoring. And then again, just into those single leg ankle hops, the ability for him on both legs, left and right, to get off the ground really quick. And you see the progressions off the start where he's barely getting off the ground, that left leg, having trouble producing force, and then by the end of it, he's more equal to the other side and feeling really good. And then more intense because of his ability to produce power off the double leg, but moving into a double leg jump to a single leg landing and being able to really control that landing. And then as we progress along too, I like doing this exercise. Either start slow, the ability to move a bit more dynamically, the ability to move through a little bit more of a range with the floor moving, but mostly ensure that we're landing underneath the center of mass. Again, good hip and knee flexion to support that load. And the other important thing is when you're watching the feet, they're not crossing over midline. So hopefully he's landing supported underneath his hip, and if you imagine a gym line that's in between his feet, he's not crossing over. Where a lot of the mechanics research has come along looking at kinetic forces is the idea that with runners, with anyone who's crossing over, you're pushing that ground reaction force further outside the center of mass versus coming up through the midpoint near the belly button. So then you get a lot of that knee adduction through the through the knee, obviously that rotation, that rotational moment on the knee, and creating a lot of tension through there. Gavin, the other thing with Gavin, he was just getting a lot of patellar tendon pain that's coming back from previous injuries before, so a lot of our work on that was also monitoring not just the loading of the tibia and the stress, but also the load on the patellar tendon. And we were lucky that he had the resources, he had the time where he was in Fortius every day, but more so than that, he was checking in with his surgeon and getting imaging done every 2 weeks So we really got to see that healing and make sure nothing we were doing was disrupting that. And then again, whether it's energy system development or not, but the ability to push through the floor with higher force. So this is more the same single leg running exercise, but pushing through the resistance jets. Depending on the purpose of this, with Gavin being a volleyball player, is mostly for him to drive off of a single leg. He's never jumped, although he jumps double leg a lot and lands double leg, he's never landing perfectly in a volleyball game. He's jumping to the side to block, he's landing on one leg, he's landing with his upper body completely contorted. So something that we want to be aware of, but we're obviously not going to push that too much in the pool. With other people with this exercise, I really like to focus on the leg that's not contacting the ground and that hip drive on the other side for the ability to create that vertical force and help with that push off. So something using this exercise with sprinters, that can be quite important. And then lastly, looking into training load monitoring. So with Gavin, we knew we had a certain point we had to get with. So we were able to talk to all the coaches of the Canadian national volleyball team. They were able to send us data on where their typical number of jumps per week and typical number of jumps per match in a game for each individual player. So we were lucky enough to have all that data from Gavin that you might not typically have on all of your clients that you're seeing. So there was good communication with the S&C coaches back in Quebec, and then having all that data allowed us to know where he was going to be when he returned to training, knowing he had three weeks to prep in training as well, so it doesn't have to be right back to those numbers. But we can make sure we're progressing and not leaving himself. Obviously, we have to make sure that he can progress and he can tolerate the load we're applying, but then know that he's not going to have a huge spike in acute training load as soon as he gets back to practice. So we were measuring everything cardiovascularly, whether he was in strength and conditioning, whether he was in physio or in hydro with the Polar Team 2 system. And then we were also, for the main training load monitoring with an external force, we were looking to use the number of jumps, and that was in physio, hydro, strength and conditioning, and when he started beach volleyball. So each week, we would increase progressively the number of jumps, but we wanted to make sure that there was a fairly consistent ratio where we weren't increasing his regular load and on an acutely basis too high. So that was a gradual increase and something that we were quite concerned about, because that's typically not necessarily in jumping, but literature suggests in other areas that acute to chronic training load ratio can be preventative of injuries and can potentially show where injuries are occurring. So the biggest thing was communication with the coach and making sure everyone was on board. With somebody of Gavin's caliber, they knew how serious this could be with the history he's had, so they were very compliant and they were excellent to work with. So why did we really choose to jump in the pool the entire time? So I thought this was something that was really important. I just want to go over a little bit of the literature because it's something that I've spoken about before at different conferences, and a lot of people don't tend to use. But when we're getting into schedules where there's more competition in this small point of time, but we're trying to either maintain or we're trying to enhance any performance variable throughout the year or in season, it's something where you have the ability to increase or maintain performance with putting less stress through the injury. And for somebody like Gavin, the ability to control that eccentric load from a jump and the ability for the body to tolerate that is extremely important. I would not recommend by any means only jumping in the pool, and that's why we were doing a lot of things like coming down off of boxes, drop jumps in the gym. We were also doing some cleans and some snatches and the ability for him to accept force on land through controlled amounts of weight. So I wouldn't recommend only doing in the water, but it is something, depending on where you're at, the ability to maintain that performance, to try to get some of the strength benefits and building that up, especially the concentric muscle action, while putting less stress. So for him, someone who's already getting that stress, if he's going to a volleyball practice or he's playing beach volleyball, he's getting a lot of that stress through, but we're able to control for that stress as much as possible, progress that a little bit slower, and hopefully enhance his vertical jump, get his confidence back, and the ability to create that contraction. That concentric muscle action. So just a little bit of the literature. There's tons of papers out there, but consistently aquatic plyometric training has been shown to increase vertical jump, peak torque production, sprintability. This is in a variety of different athletes, some in volleyball players, some in untrained individuals, obviously, some in semi-professional basketball players, so people who jump a lot. Another interesting study looked at aquatic conditions and sand versus compared to land. And this is something that I thought was quite important because he was going back to beach volleyball with the idea that it's going to help create less of an eccentric force and stress through landing. So we're lucky enough in Vancouver in the summer to have tons of beach volleyball courts on the ocean. So he was playing beach volleyball. A certain amount of jumps were prescribed to him each day, knowing that there's going to be a bit more stress than in the pool, but not as much as jumping on land. And that's exactly what this study shows. The increases are seen in strength. The increases are seen in sprinting as well. And they tend to mimic land when they're done by the same duration. Again, you have to create that toleration to land. You couldn't only do it in water, but when you're trying to increase the amount of jumps you're doing for an individual, either within your side of your microcycle or during in-season, this offers an opportunity for people. And then, again, just another time where the aquatic training resulted in similar training effects compared to your land-based with possible reduction in stress due to the impact because of obviously the buoyancy and because of the resistance upon landing in the water. So this is something that we took quite seriously and something that we use to try to help him progress towards his goal. And again, this was in conjunction with everything else he was doing. So he was still increasing volleyball-specific movements in physio, where he was jumping more to a greater intensity. He was increasing the actual landing and eccentric forces off of boxes, again with snatches and cleans in S&C and strength and conditioning, so that was something he was doing. Whereas in hydro, I was trying to create as much concentric muscle action as possible to have him drive through resistance, considering water is 800 times more dense than air, and really try to build up his tolerance. So when he went back to training, he was still in communication with us, and we progressed the amount of jumps moving back. So this, I believe this case study turned out pretty well. Gavin went back. He had a little bit, and just to be honest, had a little bit of trouble when he went back to playing at the Olympic qualifiers, where he had a little bit of pain and stuff through there, but was able to get through it. Was able to train for the Olympics, where the Canadian team did quite well in competition. And then now he's back. So this is post-Olympics, probably 5 to 6 months. He's back to playing professionally on a regular basis in Poland at a very high level. So this progression seemed to work very well for us. But of course, it's going to be different depending on each different person's clients and each different athlete you have. But this I wanted to show as a progression of different exercises from increased demand on the tissue, increased force, increased load, and just try to build up strength and create different demands. So this is how we use the pool throughout the throughout the rehab process for a lot of individuals, and specifically this is the progression that we use for Gavin from a hydrotherapy perspective. So for me, that's pretty much my presentation. I'd like to take some time to answer any questions that you may have. My email is at the bottom of this slide, so please feel free if you have any additional questions that we don't get to today to ask me any questions or provide me any feedback or anything that you've seen differently when you use some of these exercises or anything that has worked. And I always like to hear from different people who use different HydroWorx pools on how they use them, and just to try to all help each other and make sure that we are promoting such a great product and have the ability to help as many athletes as we can.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. And yes, as Nick said, we will go ahead and begin the Q&A session now. So just as a reminder, if you have any questions, please type those into the webinar dashboard there on the right side of your screen, and we'll ask them to Nick. And we have had several questions come in already, Nick. So we'll go ahead and get started. How much is the rehabilitation process a collaborative effort between the rehab team and the athlete surgeon?
Oh, that's something that we have that we think is quite important, and that's something that we do quite a bit of. We have some in-house surgeons, so depending on who the athlete is, there will be some more interaction. From Gavin specifically, the surgeon that completed his surgery, and we were lucky that that was the surgeon that went to the Olympics for Team Canada, so there's a lot of contact there, but there was a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of phone calls. There's a lot of discussion on how he's healing, what the load could be. And in terms of infections, in terms of the work the surgeon's done, we tend to kind of listen and respect the viewpoint of the surgeon. So in this specific case, there was a lot, and I think that's important. But that being said, in all other cases, there is times where it's less, but we still make sure we're reaching out and we have good communication there.
Okay, great. So obviously, so a lot of these videos you showed here in your presentation were through the view of the video monitors that are part of your pool system. But how might you monitor the postural alignment if you did not have those kinds of video monitors in your pool?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not 100% sure that I have the best answer to that. I know some people have played with different like GoPros and things like that. The one camera that HydroWorx has, maybe Kyle can touch on that, but it works really well for underwater footage. It's just the inability to get that real-time feedback, which the pools really offer you. So the best way is if the water's clear, if you're able to see the client obviously getting down and trying to change the reflection of light in the water and trying to see trying to just see as much of the body as you can and not being distorted by the level of water. But it's really hard to say, and that's one of the best values of having the two TV screens, because it's not very often that you or that a client gets the opportunity to see the frontal and sagittal plane at the same time. Typically, we're placing athletes in front of a mirror in the frontal plane, and they're turning to the side looking over their shoulder. But the ability to manage both, because they're quite important, is great, and that's something that really HydroWorx has done a great job of providing. So people have used some underwater cameras. You can watch those. You can share that with the client. The other thing is I do a lot of video on my phone, and I have a waterproof case. But then it allows me to also put it in an app where I can really slow it down. So sometimes if we're talking sprinting, we're talking running, the resistance of the water helps, but we want to make sure they're landing underneath their center of mass, because that's something that's critical for the kinetic forces. We have the opportunity to slow it down and see where they're landing. Are they heel striking in front of their center of mass, or they're creating a large braking force that can be up to, on land, 2.5 to 3.5 times body weight, which is quite large, or are they landing underneath them, which helps support that? So I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but I rely on the cameras a lot, and unfortunately I don't have obviously I spend a lot of time looking at the client as well, and not only using the camera, because you only get half of the view of the individual. So moving up the chain and being aware of that's quite important as well, obviously. But in terms of getting the lower body, it's tough to say.
Okay, yeah, I think that answers it well. This next question is, can you recommend any other hydrotherapy exercises which involve change of direction? This person says they're listening from New Zealand, where rugby is the national sport. Oh, very nice. Well, thank you for listening.
Yeah, I do a lot of other lateral movements as well. For me, I've tried a ton of things that I think will work, and they go very poorly. And then I try a lot of things that end up working really well. So anytime you're doing any lateral pushing against the jet, for example, with a static flow, the floor not moving, that can be a great way to create a driving force, as long as you're not just leaning into the jet. The other thing is, again, then just creating some movement with the floor moving as well. But I find this doesn't work nearly as well, because the real key, obviously, to lateral movement is that application of force into the ground and that driving away, where when the floor is moving, it's harder to create that. I have done some lateral bounding, some kind of like skating kind of motions where you're driving, controlling your landing, pushing off, and you're kind of going in a zigzag pattern as you go from the back to the front of the pool. So that's something that definitely can be done. And then that single leg running exercise that I showed, with the slower speed, it can be done creating some lateral movement as well, where you're jumping a little bit, we're creating a little bit of lateral displacement from right to left and right to left, staying on that. You can either go from right leg to left leg, but I like to stay just on the right leg and then move to just using the left leg to jump side to side.
Okay, and the next question is, when using hydrotherapy programs, do you find patient compliance to be better compared to other rehabilitation programs?
That's a good question. I find, I don't know if they're necessarily better. I find that It's less well known, obviously, than traditional physio, which has been around for a lot longer. So I find the biggest thing for me is clients, when they come in, they expect to be on an underwater treadmill. They have no clue what that is. So seeing the underwater treadmill is completely different than hearing about it, and then trying it again is completely different. So I find the progressions, the natural progressions on land are easier to see, even for somebody who's never been in physio. Whereas when you come into hydrotherapy on the underwater treadmill, people expect a treadmill is just walking and running. So one of the things that I try to do to try to create compliance is to really try to explain to them how we're going to work and how the progressions are going to be made and what really the capabilities of their rehab protocol can be. And I think that helps them understand how they progress from the start to the end versus just walking, increasing the treadmill, walking again, increasing the treadmill, running. So that ability to see how it can be done, a lot of the sessions are done doing similar exercises to land, but the ability to do it sooner and in conjunction with physio, I think helps create creates more of a reliable client. But in terms of adherence to the program, I find the people who want to be adherent, the people who are investing in themselves, they're adherent on land and in water. The people who are in for a quick fix, they don't necessarily spend as much time in hydro or in land-based physio. But the big key for me is that I get the question all the time, like, am I able to do this rehab without hydrotherapy? And of course you are. There's a lot of people that do. But I'm quite honest about how I think it will help, how I've seen from other clients it does help. And right from the very start, I try to take them through that journey of how I think it can help promote healing, help promote confidence, and increase the movements and the efficiency of their rehab.
Okay. And the next person asked, Nick, would you mind reminding us what was the specific surgery that this athlete had?
Yeah, this athlete had, so he had tibial stress fracture, so we had tibial nailing where they put, I think it was 24 for him, in shaft through his tibia to just try to help with that structure of the, the structure of the tibia and that healing and just help absorbing the forces there. So he had the rod put directly through his shin, obviously vertically through, and then he had a bone graft as well just to help with some previous stress fractures on the other side that hadn't healed very well.
Okay, and we've had a couple questions have come in regarding the time and frequency of the aquatic workouts. And you mentioned that you do water therapy concurrently with land therapy, but are those sessions, would you do both of those sessions on the same day, or would you do them on different days?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something I get all of the time, and there's no exact science. So I can stick to Gavin, where Gavin was doing 3 times a week in hydrotherapy. So he was in Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So off the start, that was something where we were just doing those initial movements, that movement skills assessment, as we called it. And then we moved into running, we moved into jumping. And near the end, he would have either, depending on his load when he got into beach, he'd have 1 day that's jumping in the pool with 2 days that were running and energy system specific. And then, but more before we got into beach volleyball, he was doing either 2 days or 3 days of jumping, just trying to increase that tolerance with less running. So it kind of all progressed and ebb and flowed through his rehab. Typically with clients, so for Gavin, he was doing physio and hydro, or hydro and physio, or hydro and S&C on the same day, or sometimes he just had hydro as well. But if you're extrapolating that to other clients, it really depends on how they respond. I have some clients, generally when clients feel good in the pool, they feel good after. I have clients that when they feel great in the pool and later they get a bit sore. So if the client can tolerate physio and then hydro, we do that quite often. It saves them a trip in. If they can't, we split it up. And it really depends on the purpose and what myself and the physio, or myself and the strength coach believe they're getting out of it. So for me, sometimes hydro before physio helps them a lot. It increases a little bit of range of motion, that dynamic movement, that elasticity of the muscle. Whereas sometimes that manual therapy that they're getting in physio is extremely important before they come in the pool. So we'll change who they see first. but oftentimes it's about, there is some scheduling conflicts. Obviously, you don't always get the best case scenario that you want, but a lot of the time we will see 2 on the same day, but not always.
And how long is a typical hydrotherapy session?
It goes, I would say that for me, 75% of my sessions are 30 minutes long, pushing into that 40-minute range. We do tend to do a lot of, or a good amount of hour-long sessions as well, but anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes typically.
Okay, and how do you measure strength improvement in the pool to progress resistance? I assume this is in regards to the jet resistance when running.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't necessarily judge for running the jet off of strength, unless you're talking about like aerobic power and cardiovascular strength. But typically, I'm trying to get, when we're running for a purpose. So yes, sometimes that is to increase the load through the injury or the injured limb. But typically for me, I'm trying to hit the cardiovascular demand where we are staying around aerobic threshold if we're working on the aerobic system, or we're getting above the anaerobic threshold where we're not spending time in that middle zone where they're not getting a lot of benefit from it. So for me, it's more about when they're running, how does their gait look? So some clients I have, they'll look fantastic at 5 miles an hour and 40% jet, let's say. And then when I put them to 5.5 miles per hour, they just can't control it as well. They're not landing well. Their whole stride, that whole cycle just doesn't look right. And it takes some time to adapt. But for that session, I would then increase the jet to make sure I'm getting the metabolic demand that I want, and I want them to be at, with putting and leaving that at a stride at that 5 miles an hour that they can control and that they look good at and they have comfort in. Eventually, we're going to build up speed as well, but that's kind of how I use it. It gives me the other opportunity to add more resistance. The other important thing I find too is when you increase the resistance for more demanding exercise, it's important for the client or the athlete not to lean into the jet too much. So this is, I always tell people that they're trying to do more of a top-end run, like top-end speed run versus more of an accelerative speed where they're leaning forward 45 degrees and then pushing up. The jet works more for me as a harness to hold them in spot and allows them to drive their legs and drive through the floor and create as much hip flexion as they can versus trying to really push through the jet. So in terms of strength, I progress the exercises without the resistance jet more as changing the depth of the water and then obviously increasing the range of motion through the joint, but then also moving their hands to their hips or moving their hands on their shoulders and just using less of their hands to push up through the water and trying to get more of that coming from driving through the floor with the leg versus shifting the hips and the trunk.
Great. Now, obviously, in this case study, you had Gavin jumping in the water as a volleyball player, but do you typically like to incorporate sport-specific exercises into your hydrotherapy sessions? And if so, can you give us any other examples?
Yes and no. I mean, I find a lot of people or some individuals will try their absolute hardest to make everything sport-specific, which I do agree is extremely important as long as it is practical and effective. There's some things in the pool that just don't necessarily carry over in terms of sport specificity. So some things I have done is those similar sessions when I did a rehab with a former Premier League soccer player, and he was the captain of the Whitecaps at the time, Jay Demerit. And some things we will do for him is when he's doing some of those jumps, and especially when he's doing some reaction-based movement of high knees left and right, we would throw a soccer ball in so he's jumping and heading it back and getting used to that contact point and just adding another element of more reaction into that. I have played with football players, American football players, kind of either backpedaling on the treadmill, catching a football, and then sprinting against a jet. It works fairly well for some people, so that's something we will include. And in terms of anything else that's more sport specific, we include some stuff. I try to include some stuff you're obviously helping the client because it gives them the opportunity to get a bit more into their element and something they're used to doing. But I always want to make sure that it's actually going to be functional and it's not going to take away from any of the more less fun but important points you're trying to get across.
And is there any other equipment that you used in the pool with Gavin or that you have used for other athletes during their hydrotherapy sessions?
Yeah. So for Gavin, there's the TheraBands that we use as well. Sometimes, like for shoulder injuries and stuff, we do have the webbed gloves and trying to increase resistance there sometimes. We don't have any of the, I can't remember the exact name of them, but the dumbbells that HydroWorx provides. I do think they're a good tool and they've been used in other cases. So if you're increasing upper body work, that's something that we do. We sometimes use a little bit of just some medicine balls, not necessarily heavy ones, because obviously you're trying to reduce the load and not necessarily try to add a ton more. But when we get to the point where we want a little bit more load, or we want them holding the ball up over their head so it creates a little bit more of a challenge, we use that. We have balance boards as well, but I tend not to use those. I personally don't find them to be as extremely as effective because he's used to standing on a stable surface. He's using to have the ankle stability and support there. So I tend to focus more on that, using the jet to change that a little bit. So honestly, I use a little bit of equipment, but a lot of the time I don't use that much. I try to progress them through increased load, increased physiological parameters, and just by progression of exercises.
Okay, thank you. Nick, you mentioned that obviously with the Olympics coming up, this rehabilitation happened in a pretty tight time frame. Did Gavin come back to Fortius after the Olympics to continue his hydrotherapy or other physical therapy? After
the Olympics, sorry?
Yes.
No, he hasn't come back after the Olympics because he pretty much went right to Poland. So it's something where he may come back in the future in the off season, but just the way that it worked out with the with scheduling, pretty much after the Olympics, he had a little bit of a break where he went back to his hometown in Saskatchewan to spend some time with family, then ended up going to join the team in Poland.
Okay, and in a somewhat related question, were there any exercises that you worked with in the water with Gavin or that you would do normally specifically to prevent re-injury of that same injury?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything we were doing specifically is to try to prevent that re-injury, which is obviously a challenging thing to do. One of the best predictors of future injury is past injury, obviously, so that's something that you're always worried about. I think I always get this question of, is this going to train? Is this going to apply to land? Is this going to carry over to land? And I often find it does. But you have to understand the forces that are being exhibited on the body when you're on land, and the amount that the body's going up in a 3-set to 5-set match, the amount of force that's going through the body. So I think you have to have the ability to train at the demand of the sport to be able to perform at that sport. You can't keep everything extremely light to try to prevent re-injury, and then when he goes into a demanding situation, that's obviously over the level of tolerance. So everything we were doing, from jumping, from the movements, we're trying to make sure he's even 50-50. We're trying to make sure that he's able to land on one leg and control that movement. We're trying to make sure that he can, if he lands a bit off center, he's still fairly balanced when he's reacting to the sport. The amount of jumps we're providing, we're trying to make sure that's close to what he's experiencing in training and then in a game. So for hydro specific, everything I was trying to do was to prevent re-injury, but more importantly, it was the number of jumps, the number of stress. Everything was monitored through one of his jump sensors that he has, that he's always used. And try to make sure that, yes, the pool's different, yes, the beach is different, and trying to factor in that eccentrically he's not getting as much, but concentrically he's getting the same or more in the water. So we need to up that on land. And we had discussions whether he needs to up that in terms of jumping and landing. Can you get it from drop jumps where you're now not worrying as much about the concentric because that's being taken care of? again with adding load to squats or snatches or anything like that, and then obviously in his volleyball training. So I think everything in a way is definitely specific and trying to prevent any re-injury possible. But the number one thing is going to be time to heal, obviously, and usually the rehab protocols that go really well are the people who tend to heal well naturally, and the ones that take a lot longer are ones where there's a longer inflammatory process and things aren't going as well, and it's just taking longer to heal. So you're always working on building strength, building that physiological compliance, building as much of an athlete as you can, but that bone, that muscle, that joint still needs to heal.
Great. Well, it looks like that is all the time that we have for questions for this session. So I would like to thank our presenter, Nick Held, and I'd certainly like to thank all of the attendees for joining us today. As I mentioned before, you will all receive a recording of today's webinar after the session, and I'd like to remind you to please fill out the brief survey that will pop up as you exit the webinar. And if you did have any additional questions, feel free to indicate those on the survey there, and we'll make sure to get those to Nick. Thank you all so much, and have a great afternoon.